Today we're talking about how Deathwalker single-handedly changed the solo lane meta. This is not an exaggeration, that is exactly what happened. What exactly happened though? Well, first of all, Rival, formerly known as Cyclone, now going under the Rival tag, played very well overall at the recent gauntlet. They were expected to be a lower seeded team and kind of stay there, but they made their way all the way to the top and actually this way qualified for Masters by beating some of the much higher seeded teams. One of the players in this team was Deathwalker. And Deathwalker played some unconventional stuff, namely a Puch solo lane, something that we're not going to go into detail here, but an interesting topic on its own. And what he did when he played Warriors in solo is that he almost always built the same things as long as he was against any physical enemy. Those things were Death Tall, then depending on the character it was Warrior Tabi or Ninja Tabi. For example, on Elang Shen he went Warrior Tabi, on Bellona he went Ninja Tabi, Mark of the Vanguard, Mystical Mail. Now, parts of this build are nothing new. Death Toll is very common for pretty much any warrior that's decent with basic attacks or has a swing chain that has AoE swings, or is like Bellona and gets AoE swing through an ability. And boots, well, are pretty much always built. The decision between Warrior Tabi and Ninja Tabi is mostly down to how much ability damage you deal and how many basic attacks you utilize. Some guards can really make use of both. The benefit of building Ninja Tabi in this context is that Ninja Tabi shortens the time that your movement speed penalty will be existent. So if you're trying to stick to the enemy longer, then Ninja Tabi is usually a little bit better. The difference is not that major though, so both options are viable for many. These are your standard items. Then there's Mark of the Vanguard. Now Mark of the Vanguard has seen a rise in solo lane. It is often picked up as the first item on Guardian solo laners simply because the other items don't benefit them that much there, in many cases, not always. But it's not that common on Warriors, though it has been picked up. Usually on Warriors, you will see it being picked up after another starter because the other starters in solo lane are really beneficial. So these items all are kind of familiar, at least to some degree, and will be built or were built beforehand. Mystical Mail, on the other hand, not so much. Now, Mystical Mail was a good item at any point really, due to the fact that the AoE tick damage from its passive is always going to be good. This extra damage can really add up through the game. The damage numbers that you have in the end can be almost close to your carry simply because you can be in the middle of a team fight and deal consistent damage to everyone around you, and that's just a huge effect. The problem with Mystical Mail was mostly the price. 2,700 gold doesn't sound too much. There are mid laners that can get away with building items like that, but it's another story in solo lane. Solo lane is all about counter building, especially early on, and you want to win those early trades because otherwise you get bullied out of lane. That means you lose pressure, you lose gold, you lose objective control on your side of the map, and that is really important for a solo laner. At the same time, the base stats on Mystical Mail are great. It has a lot of effective health due to the fact that it mixes 300 health and 40 physical protections, but it doesn't have as much target-specific protection of one kind as many other items have that you would utilize in solo lane to counter your opponent early on. For example, Height of the Nemean Lion is built a lot and has 80 physical protection, while costing at 2,200 gold. Or the more common older option that is not used quite as much anymore but still a lot by ability based characters is Breath of Valor, which costs 2,300 gold and still has 65 physical protection. This protection just means a lot early, and the tier 2 item here already has 35 physical protection. The tier 2 item of Mystical Mail, Steel Mail, which you're gonna be stuck on for quite a while, has 20 physical protection. It has 200 health, but once again, you will still take more damage from the abilities directly, and sustaining is harder because the extra health will not help you if you have HP 5 or pots or anything like that. And that is exactly where Mark of the Vanguard comes in. Mark of the Vanguard on its own has 100 health, 10 physical protection, and a 5 damage reduction for all abilities, all attacks. So if we add this together, Steel Mail, the tier 2, and Mark of the Vanguard, we have a price tag of 2,200 gold, same as Height of the Nemean Lion. We get a total of 30 physical protection, 300 health, and all damage reduced by 5. And the all damage reduced by 5 is really the important part here. This includes minion damage, which is quite a significant chunk early on. It includes any kind of tick damage, and it includes regular basic attacks as well as abilities. Another important thing it includes is bluestone ticks, bluestone pendant ticks. All these ticks are reduced by Mark of the Vanguard. And now consider what the most commonly bought starter item for solo laners that are ability focused is, for those who can bully with their abilities in lane, those who are more about early game mostly because that's when abilities are more impactful than basic attacks. Exactly, they're building Bluestone Pendant. For example, Tyr will almost always go for Bluestone Pendant. Hercules will almost always go for Bluestone Pendant. Odin will almost always go for Bluestone Pendant. So there are a lot of warriors that really make use of that. There are more. Sun Wukong, Vamana, you name it. Many gods that can make use of both. Chark is another one. There's a ridiculous amount of solo laners that really work well with Bluestone Pendant. Not all of them were very high in the meta beforehand, but having Mark of the Vanguard always countered them. Mark of the Vanguard has been very beneficial in that regard ever since the beginning. I personally like to build Mark of the Vanguard in third slot against Tyr just because it was so effective against him, with his damage being kind of separated between a lot of abilities and ticks. And now, what will those ability-focused warriors usually go for? Breastplate of Valor. Price tag of 2,300 gold, and a reasonable amount of protections on the item, CDR to use more abilities, and so on. All of this is somewhat countered by Mark of the Vanguard, plus building the tier 2 of Mystical Mail, Steel Mail, if you finish it around the same time as the enemy does. You're not gonna have the bully potential that they have during that time. It's actually the time we should play back a little bit. I made a mistake in that very situation in the gameplay in the back. Maybe it's in here where you will see that I go too aggressive when I have those items, because what you're doing is you're just basically delaying a little bit. You're gonna have enough protections to survive and not get bullied out. You don't get the same benefits that the enemy does for a moment, and you're just looking to finish that big power spike with Mystical Mail. This, by the way, also applies for the tier 1. They're slightly more expensive. If you build Mark of the Vanguard into tier 1, then it would be to just build the tier 2 of Breastplate of Valor, Silver Breastplate, but it kinda evens itself out a little more. It's not that far apart. The big gap really that you need to fill is the 1,300 gold to fully buy Mystical Mail, and that's why it wasn't bought. It was a problem to buy Mystical Mail right off the bat because you couldn't play back enough, you would get bullied too much, and there would be too much of a gap in between that you wouldn't be able to fill, and you would take so much damage. You would take way too much damage for it to be reasonable to be rushed. Combining Mark of the Vanguard and Mystical Mail completely makes up for that, and that's why Deathwalker established this meta so hard that pretty much anyone is building it at the moment. Even if they're not building Mystical Mail, they will still be building Mark of the Vanguard even on ability-focused solo laners, because it's just too potent to pass up on it. This is something you see in Masters all the time now. I can imagine certain counter strategies, for example, starting with Mark of the Vanguard right away on ability-focused warriors, but that's something that hasn't happened yet, and for now we will see a lot of Mystical Mail. This also changes how solo lane is played, and you will see that if you watch Masters at the moment already. Now, what still stands out a little bit is Guardians in solo, but even they are somewhat countered by Mark of the Vanguard because usually they have a little lower damage, and while the physical protection doesn't help, the direct damage reduction does, and it still helps against minions. But the primary point here is how the meta shifts for the warriors. Bellona was beforehand not regarded a very high pick. She was still okay, she was still out there, but she wasn't somebody who would be picked all the time. Likewise, Osiris, after his buff, was considered a lot stronger, but he wasn't the god that you would always see being picked. Right now, we're seeing a lot more of both. I do also expect Erlang Shen to be picked up more, and certain gods may be willing to switch over to Death Toll instead of Bluestone. Those who usually make somewhat of a decent use of both, like Amaterasu or Raven, for example, can now consider switching completely to Death Toll, because if the enemy gets Mark of the Vanguard, the value of Bluestone Pendant is significantly lowered. The solo laners that are more ability focused that we've seen so far, for the most part, weren't that successful. For example, Hercules got very much bullied out in one of the matches, and I think this will transition over to casual games unless something changes in the near future or somebody finds a counter strategy that isn't there yet, simply because of the fact that there's very little you can do against it, and once Mystical Mail comes online, the solo laner with Mystical Mail will be a lot more impactful than the other, due to the fact that he has so much higher damage and so much more presence throughout the game. As long as he sticks around teamfights, he will have an impact at all times, something that is not true for a solo laner that's more focused on abilities and doesn't get the same damage off against so many targets at the same time. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was insightful, I hope this was informative. If you are not subscribed yet, feel free to click that sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. Also, this is only the first video for today, we're gonna do the second one later hopefully, if it all works out. So, see you later for that one. Duke Sloth, out.